Good day, and thank you for joining, and welcome to another consultation and discussion for the study on Country Safeguard Systems, or CSS, of the Asian Development Bank. This consultation forms part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process, or SPRU, as you may hear us refer to it as. My name is Azim Manji. I am your consultation moderator for this session. This is our 13th thematic consultation topic so far, and this is the first in a series of consultations and discussions on country safeguard systems. In today's consultation, we are joined not only by Bruce Dunn, a director within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of the ADB, but also by Zara Abbas, a principal environment specialist within the Safeguards Division, again in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. For this first of 5 sessions on the theme of country safeguard systems, this inaugural session is primarily with government stakeholders of the ADB in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Of the 99 of you who registered, we have 68 who are external stakeholders of the ADB, and 61 of you are joining from 19 countries in these 3 regions specifically. We are joined by 7 other participants from 5 countries in other regions, and we have 1 advanced question. In this consultation, Ms. Zara Abbas will present the main summary issues related to the study that she and her team have authored on country safeguard systems. Ms. Abbas will also explore the relationship of the study of relevance to the Safeguards Policy Update. From the presentations delivered by Ms. Abbas and Mr. Dunn, we are hoping that participants like yourselves will share insights on the potential gaps of the provisions and implementation of the 2009 policy. We also hope that we can hear from you about recommendations to ensure the strengthening of the forthcoming revised policy. Your comments received from this consultation will inform the revision of ADB's safeguards policy. Before I call upon our speakers, here's a few gentle reminders. As all stakeholders and participants have consented when joining, the ADB is recording this session for the purposes of preparing a summary of the meeting. It is the intention that these recordings will be available to ADB staff and consultants, and then more broadly, to members of this consultation publicly. If you have any concerns about this, please contact the Secretariat at the email address that's being flashed in the chat box now. A reminder to please join from a quiet, distraction-free area, and we request that you please turn off your microphone when you're not speaking. During the Q&A session, you may ask questions by typing them into the chat box or raising your hand virtually. You will then be asked to unmute yourself and turn on your camera if you wish, so you can ask your question live. As we're all colleagues, please be respectful to each other and ensure a collegial atmosphere. We will manage time to keep within our schedule and to also ensure that we have enough time for the Q&A sessions. IT and technical support is being provided, and you may ask for this support by typing your issue or query into the chat box in any of the languages we're using today, and someone will be happy to assist you. As we're all joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance notes when using the important Zoom buttons. Aside from English, as you can see on the screen, we have simultaneous interpretation in Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese. To access the simultaneous interpretations feature, click on the globe icon found on the lower part of your Zoom screen and select Preferred Language. When you select the preferred language, press the Mute Original Audio button so you can clearly hear the language of your simultaneous interpreter. For those of you listening in Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, or Vietnamese, if you feel the simultaneous interpretation is too fast and the interpreter is struggling to match the pace of the English speaker, you can ask the original English speaker to slow down by going to the bottom of the Zoom screen and clicking on the reactions button. When you've clicked on the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can then press the slow down button, which is the two reverse arrows pointing to the left in white. This will let the English speakers know to slow down accordingly. We ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name on Zoom, click on the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, look for your own name. When you see your name, click on the More button on the right-hand side of your name. Then click on the Rename button, and this will allow you to type in your name, the agency you represent, and then you can click OK to make that permanent. If you wish to send a message, question, or share feedback, click on the Chat button. If you wish to comment or raise a question live in the language you prefer, click on the smile icon or the reactions button, again at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then click on the raise hand emoji. To speak and unmute yourself, click on the microphone icon, and then to show your video, if you wish, click on the video icon. The ADB values diverse and informed feedback from the wide range of stakeholders assembled today. So let me refer you to the slides on ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations. Now, I'm not going to read everything on the slide, but just a reminder here that, again, these sessions are being recorded and documented and will subsequently be distributed during and for each event. This allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to, as necessary, any comments and inputs made. If you wish to opt out of the recording and distribution of the recordings, please contact the Secretariat through the email address that's flashed on the chat box now. If you have any issues or concerns on recording, confidentiality, the potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination during the course of the consultations, please get in touch with the Secretariat. In this consultation, we have about 2 hours, and here's what is planned to maximize both your time as well as ours. As you can see from the agenda, firstly, Mr. Bruce Dunn will provide his welcome remarks. Mr. Dunn, as I mentioned, is the Director of the Safeguards Division in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Second, we have Ms. Sarah Abbas, who will share the main issues and findings of the nature and context of the study on country safeguard systems as related to the revision of the Safeguards Policy Statement and its forthcoming update. After the second presentation by Ms. Abbas, we will have a brief 5-minute break. And when we resume, we will have a moderated discussion facilitated by Mr. Gelson Garcia, the Senior Social Engagement Specialist on the Stakeholder Engagement Team, also within the Safeguards Division. Gelson will serve as the Q&A moderator. This will be a Q&A session that runs for about 75 minutes. And you may ask your questions and share experiences in the chat box or live in English, Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese. And this will be done through raising your hand as previously explained in the Zoom functions. Gelson will prompt us with guide questions to frame the conversation. Please then join us for a quick event evaluation before turning you back to Director Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap-up and the next steps following the consultation. As such, and without any further ado, I would like to call upon Director Bruce Dunn for his welcome remarks. Mr. Dunn, if you please.
Thank you very much, Azin. And good morning, welcome, and thank you so much for all of our developing member countries and other participants for joining today. It's a great pleasure to be with you here for this very important topic that we're going to be covering on country safeguard systems. Now, the purpose of this session is really to provide an opportunity to share experiences and lessons and look at the work that ADB has been doing around both the strengthening and use of country safeguard systems. And we're very much looking forward to hearing your views in terms of what has been working and not working and the advantages and disadvantages of different approaches. But before I go into further details on that, I'd like to just start with a bit of background in terms of the approach that we are taking for the policy update. Of course, quite a number of you that are joining today, I see, have joined previous sessions. So thank you again for coming back and joining a continued dialogue with us. But as usual, there are some people that are joining for the first time. So please bear with me while I just provide a little bit of background there. Now, as Ian has mentioned already, that this is our 13th thematic consultation. And of course, we've been covering a lot of different topics already. We've been working through a process of analytical studies and regional consultations to feed into the update approach. But we actually started in August 2020, and this followed an evaluation of the effectiveness of ADB's safeguard policy statement by ADB's independent evaluation department. And that evaluation study made several recommendations. The first was that ADB should modernize and update the Safeguard Policy Statement, or SPS for short, and we should do so building on the evidence from the SPS implementation experience, as well as looking at recent safeguard policy updates by other multilateral financial institutions. Plus, we should customize the new policy for the work that ADB does in both sovereign financing with you, our developing member countries, as well as the work that we do with non-sovereign financing with the private sector. Plus, the IED recommended that ADB should adopt a new approach to strengthening and use of country safeguard systems. So clearly the topic that we're focused on today. Plus, we should strengthen our own implementation framework, so how we organize safeguards within ADB, and provide more guidance to our developing member countries and clients, and focus more on building skills and capacity. So these were the main areas of recommendations from the IED, and management endorsed all of these recommendations. We then moved to kickstart an update process, which is expected to be implemented over about 2.5 years, with the approval of the new policy targeted by March 2023, so about 1 year from now. Now you can you can find further information on the approach for the policy update, including a background paper and our stakeholder engagement plan through the Safeguard Policy Update and Review webpage. And my colleagues will be placing the links to this information in the chat window of the Zoom call if you'd like to go to that and refer to it. You'll also find there the background analytical study for the paper that we'll be discussing today on country safeguard systems. Now, then briefly just turning to the topic for today. So those of you that will be familiar with the ADB Safeguard Policy Statement will know that the strengthening of country safeguard systems is actually one of the key objectives of the policy itself. The policy firstly sets out an objective for ADB to ensure that any adverse impacts of projects really be addressed through a mitigation hierarchy. This is an approach that avoids, minimizes, mitigates, or offsets any potential impacts on affected people or the environment. So that's the first set of objectives. But then the second area of the objective focused on country safeguard systems. And that specifically says for ADB to help our borrowers and clients to strengthen their safeguard systems and to develop the capacity to manage environmental and social risks. And this is really critical because as a development institution, we of course want to be able to provide international good practice in the safeguards and the policies intended to be able to set a framework for this. But of course, every day that we work with your own systems. We need to ensure that national requirements are also met. And as a development goal, we would like to see country systems be as strong as they can be. Of course, they need to be tailored to the particular circumstances of the country, the sovereign circumstances that you work within. And of course, that is set by your own governments and following your own laws and legislation. So it's an important underpinning for all of the work that we do together. Now, to support strengthening of systems, ADB has provided about $50 million in technical assistance over the past 10 years. That has been used to support about 40 of our developing member countries. So almost all of our developing member countries in some way or another, either at a regional level or more focused at country level, have received some level of support from the ADB for supporting systems. This has ranged from work with policy and legal reform, guidance development and tool development, so that's more at the country level, as well as down to project levels. And at the project level, we've provided additional technical expertise, supported assessments, undertaken studies around the project level systems and any differences between the ADB systems and how they might be addressed at the project level. And we often use the project as a vehicle for addressing any particular capacity constraints or gaps that are needed to address the specific project level risks. So that two-tier of work, both working at the country level as well as linking down to the project level, has been part of ADB's support. Plus, many of you would know that the policy also provides the potential to use country systems where they are considered to be equivalent to the policy objectives, policy scope and policy principles of the ADB, as well as where there is acceptable implementation capacity and track record. My colleague Zara will go into further details on the methodology in a few minutes. However, we have found it quite challenging to be able to demonstrate this. We've worked in a very focused way across 3 countries. This was picked up where there was specific requests from a developing member country for ADB to provide assistance to assess whether equivalence and acceptability of either country systems at the national level or the agency level, or we could also assess it at the sectoral level. In the cases of ADB, we've focused on 3 countries that did request support. This was India, Indonesia, and excuse me, and also Sri Lanka. And with those 3 countries, we have accredited for the use of country safeguard systems 1 agency in India, the Power Grid Corporation of India. However, for the assessments that were undertaken at the national level in India, the assessment work was completed, but then provided for further consideration to the government. And for Indonesia and Sri Lanka, we did further assessments, but have not yet completed accreditation processes. Again, my colleague Zara will provide some further information there. So, after 10 years, only really work completed in 3 countries, and we've only accredited 1 national level organization. So, certainly if one of the key areas of the policy was to use country systems, we've really not been able to meet that. Certainly limited success. So with that in mind, ADB's Independent Evaluation Department did review the experiences with both strengthening and use of country systems. And they essentially recommended that ADB needed to adopt a new approach towards the strengthening of borrower systems, and also make systemic improvements to the way that we look at potentially using country systems. So the studies that we've been now undertaking are looking into this. We've been looking at the experiences of ADB, but also experiences and policies of other multilateral financial institutions, looking at the way that they're approaching this, and then trying to find, as the IED suggested, a pragmatic way forward. So we're very interested to speak to you, and of course, from a developing member country perspective, I'm sure that you know, many of you will be keen for us to use country systems more, and at the same time, we need to think through how we can do that in a practical way that can also you know, manage any gaps that may exist between ADB's own policy and your own. So with that, let me finish these opening remarks, and I'll now hand over to my colleague, Ms. Sarah Abbas, who is going to provide you with a further opening presentation from the background study. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. Can you all see me and hear me properly? I didn't have a chance to check my camera.
All clear, Sarah.
All right. Okay, good. I'll just start then. So, well, Bruce has given the background, but I will still go into some of the details of how we got there and how some of these conclusions came about. So first, I'll sort of share the format. Can I have the next slide, please? So it's a very brief sort of an overview of how we're going to be proceeding with this presentation. So first, I'll give you a bit of a background of the study itself. Share the objectives and how the existing SPS covers strengthening and use of CSS, and the findings of the comparative analysis that we undertook, and what challenges emerged from there, and what's the learning, and what are the next steps that we are proposing. So can I have the next slide, please? So very briefly, the objective of the study was to deeply look at the experiences and learn from them, and see what's ADB's current SPS's approach in strengthening and the use of country safeguard systems, and to propose next steps for further consideration based on these experiences, and those and also those of our comparator MFIs that also have such provisions in their safeguards frameworks. Next slide, please. So on this slide, there's a lot of text. It's part text heavy. You can read it later, but it just gives the policy approach and how the policy covers safeguards, country safeguard systems. So as Bruce also explained, at the very objective level, the SPS emphasizes strengthening the client's safeguard systems and their capacity to manage environmental and social risks. And then the CSS may also be used. One is strengthening, the other is the use. And it also may be used at the country level, at the level of a sector, or at the level of an agency for either one of the safeguards, as the SPS currently has environment, involuntary resettlement, or indigenous peoples, or for all three of them, or any combination of them. The use of CSS is, how do we do that? We assess it through two steps. The first is an equivalence assessment is undertaken, which looks at whether the CSS is designed to meet the same objectives of the SPS, and beyond the objectives, also how does it adhere to the policies, the SPS's scopes, triggers, and applicable policy principles. So it goes beyond just objectives. And secondly, an assessment of the implementation track record is also required and undertaken to complete the assessment. And as it shows on the side, ADB continues to be in the supervisory role, and also the accountability mechanism is also, its supervision role is also still there, or the role of the accountability mechanism. Next slide, please. So here, in addition to looking at how our policy is covering CSS and how we have worked towards it, we've also reviewed the approach of other MFIs And these include the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the World Bank. And because these are the three that allow for the use of borrower systems and have experience in this. So what we will try to see is what are the key features of their methodology for assessing the feasibility of using CSS. So when we look at AIIB and Inter-American Bank, and on the slide they're mentioned separately, but when we look at this, we see that both AIIB and IDB undertake reviews of the client safeguard systems, and if these are found to be materially or functionally. The terminology is different for both, both MFIs. One uses materially, the other uses functionally, consistent with the objectives of their policy framework. And if the system is adequate to address the risks and impacts of the project for which it's proposed, the use is then allowed. So that's how they look at it. And then the gaps, if there are gaps, are filled through time-bound action plans, which become part of the legal agreements. Now, the World Bank also supports the use of borrower systems, borrower safeguard systems, if these systems address the risks and impacts of the project and achieves objectives which are materially consistent with the World Bank's environment and social standards. So the approach is similar to theirs. And in addition to that, recently, the World Bank applied the national labor laws instead of using the World Bank's environment and social framework on the standard on labor. When it was seen and was reported by national labor, by other internationally relevant labor organizations, that the law was being implemented successfully. So in that case, a standard to standard approach is also adopted by the World Bank. And they've done it at a very limited scale, but this is one experience. And in addition to that, the World Bank also uses country safeguard systems, or as they call them, borrower systems, at the level of the project. And if the project can meet the objectives which are materially consistent with the ESF or the standards, the ESSs. So in order to do this, the World Bank can conduct or does conduct, which is called an overview assessment. And that is an assessment of the borrower CSS and its implementation capacity. And the objective is to identify whether the borrower's framework needs strengthening and what are the avenues for capacity building support. So these assessments can be used to assess material consistency and also to identify capacity constraint gaps with the CSS for strengthening purposes. Next slide, please. Bruce just explained how the IED evaluation, ADB's independent evaluation department, conducted the evaluation of this SPS and found that there's a need for one of the recommendations, but there's a need for a more pragmatic approach for the use of CSS with a more sustained approach towards legislative policy and capacity development, and through a broader set of financing modalities. So that's in a nutshell what this slide says. And I think Bruce has already explained it, so I will not go into detail. I would like to share more of the findings later. So can we go to the next slide, please? So also, as Bruce mentioned, ADB has been working with our DMCs for about 10 years since the SPS came about, and has in this time gained considerable experience in working with our DMCs, the developing member countries, and implementing activities for strengthening CSS through various avenues. And this has been through the use of technical assistance financing. And building the capacity, and in this process, we have been working with them to build capacity in national safeguard systems. And this has been in different areas, such as anything that contributes to improving implementation. This can be working on developing guidance, additional training, or working with the only one implementing agency on how to improve their systems. And one key feature of this assistance has been the establishment of safeguards learning centers in Southeast Asia. And this has been in partnership with the Joint Regional Community of Practice on Safeguards, and which was established in 2016 and is a coordinating body for developing partner support. And the World Bank, the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs, and the Japan International Cooperation Agency and the World Bank are partners with ADB in this COP, and have been establishing these learning centers in the region, in Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia. Next slide, please. So in 2017, here I will talk about the experience now in use of CSS. The previous was how capacity was built across different agencies, but this is more focused, and this slide talks about which Bruce has already mentioned a little bit about how we worked with the Power Grid of India and the other assessments that we've been doing. But I'll try to go in a little bit more detail. So this is a slightly heavier slide, but I'll try to be quick. So in 2017, ADB reviewed the corporate safeguards framework of Power Grid Corporation of India and approved the use of agency-level CSS for ADB projects. Now, the difference is that not only does Power Grid have its own safeguards framework, which is not the national framework, but they have their own framework, but it also has the authority to amend that framework and improve it or make changes to it. So the safeguards assessment that was done for Power Grid identified there were gaps, and these gaps were then filled using an action plan, which was prepared and was included into the project's legal agreements. So following this one project and the experience there, between 2017 to 2019, 3 other DMCs, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and India as a whole, not as from the agency, basically from the government, because Power Grid is it's a corporation. So they also requested ADB to assess the feasibility of using country safeguard systems. So in 2017, the use of agency-level CSS for environment and involuntary resettlement was explored for Indonesia's state-owned electric company. I would probably not be pronouncing it correctly. Perusahaan Listrik Negara, which is abbreviated as PLN, and everybody knows it as PLN very well. So now, unlike the case of Power Grid, that had its own safeguards framework, PLN, while it's a state-owned company, it follows the national safeguards framework for implementing its projects. Now, to assess equivalence, each ADB SPS policy principle for environment and involuntary resettlement, along with its several components, were compared against the relevant national laws and regulations for both environment and involuntary resettlement. And wherever gaps were found, gap filling measures were identified and discussed with PLN. It was a long process. While for acceptability, the implementation practices were reviewed in detail. So as I just said, this entire process took a long time for many reasons. One was the availability and accessibility of detailed laws and regulations and their legal translation into English, discussion with other line agencies which are involved in the implementation of these safeguards at the field level, and also discussion with other MFIs that have been involved with capacity building in Indonesia and with PLN, such as the World Bank, who together with ADB had established the Safeguards Learning Center in Indonesia to build safeguards implementation capacity. So this was a long process. So the PLN Board of Directors, as I mentioned, has the authority to issue decrees that are legally binding for PLN staff and its contractors. So this was a good feature of PLN, and this made it possible to fill the equivalence gaps after identifying gap filling measures. So a gap filling action plan was agreed upon between ADB and PLN also adopted a decree to implement the gap filling action plan. However, as I said, this process took long because it was quite iterative between translations and consultations with partners externally and stakeholders. So by the time it came to the stage that it was ready, more or less, the proposal nevertheless could not be submitted to the ADB board for consideration. This was firstly because of some delays due to COVID, and then subsequently, and also changes in the national legal framework of Indonesia. And that then necessitated further analysis and further consultation. So then coming to the case of India. So concurrent with the request of Power Grid, which was in 2017 and 16, the government of India in 2016 also requested an overall national level review for all three safeguards, as well as sector level summary equivalence assessments for the power and energy sector and for the road and transport sectors. So when this was undertaken, this summary equivalence assessment, the reports were prepared and shared with the government for feedback. So once this feedback is completed, it can then be possible to submit it, to review it, to finalize it, and to discuss the next steps with the government. So in 2017, in parallel to PLN, once the PLN's process was underway, the government of Sri Lanka also requested safeguards review for the agency level use of CSS by the Road Development Authority. The RDA is also a state-owned enterprise like PLN, but in contrast to Power Grid and PLN, it does not have the authority to issue binding directives or decrees which can be used to fill gaps. So the assessments were undertaken, and there were gaps that were identified in the environmental and involuntary resettlement safeguards. However, since RDA did not have the authority to issue legally binding directives, it was not possible to legally fill the equivalence gaps with agency level regulations, as was done for Power Grid. So going forward, ADB and RDA agreed that ADB's further support should focus on acceptability, on basically building capacity of RDA safeguards in implementing projects and achieving safeguards outcomes. So this was done by updating RDA's safeguards manuals to strengthen its safeguards implementation capacity. So the next slide, please. So that was a bit long, but now we will come to seeing what the challenges were. So this experience with implementing with the current SPS methodology on checking CSS feasibility is when we went through it and analyzed it, we identified that there were some key challenges. So looking at this, there are about 3 or 4 main challenges. And the first one is the challenge of establishing equivalence. So SPS policy principles, as I explained earlier, the SPS requires equivalence not just at the objective level, but also at the level of the scope and triggers and the policy principles. So the policy principles of the SPS are very comprehensive and very complex. And there are a range of requirements embedded in each policy principle, and a single safeguards policy principle can encompass many aspects and many requirements, which when it's compared with national legal framework, may be spread across many laws and many regulations, and then correspondingly with the regulatory bodies. So making the analysis of establishing equivalence very, very complex, lengthy, and also legal. It turns out to be almost like achieving legal concurrence, congruence, sorry. So another challenge also linked with establishing equivalence is that it's an ongoing process, as we saw in the case of Indonesia, that sometimes laws and regulations change, and they may change even slightly in certain aspects, which then still triggers the requirement to revisit the assessment or completely or partially revising them. And then, of course, every time there's a change, then there needs to be consultation with the stakeholders so that they're aware of what the analysis says now. And in relation to this is also the difficulty in accurately translating DMC legal frameworks to compare with the SPS, and that also in a timely manner so that we get this, we can get the work done in time. So then coming to filling of equivalence gaps, again, when we saw these three cases of PLN, RDA Sri Lanka, and also looking at Power Grid, equivalence gaps can be filled where the agencies have the authority to make corporate rules to fill these gaps, and where it's possible to agree with the agency on a gap filling action plan. So even where there's a will to agree on an action plan, if there's no authority to be able to make those changes, then it becomes something that cannot be done. Then lastly, coming to acceptability assessments, where the track record and the implementation of safeguards is to be assessed, that was also seen to be very difficult because there was very limited data available, possibly because of different monitoring requirements. And as a result, field audits were necessary to be undertaken so that it can be seen. And that, of course, is also time consuming and comes with a cost. So what we see, and also when we see that the gap filling measures for changes in national legal frameworks may also create new gaps in acceptability. So that's these were the challenges. Next slide, please. So it was seen that agency level use of CSS was only possible where the agency had a robust system and the legal authority to change that system. So from all of this that I've just discussed, we can see that there are about 5 key lessons that we learned. So the first lesson is that pursue early and strategic engagement with our DMCs. And this can be done through ADB's country programming strategy and at the stage of country programming, which is done at the regional department. So when the regional departments are planning the country engagement with their DMCs and the country programming strategies are being developed in consultation with the countries, it would be useful to engage in early strategic policy dialogue on CSS. And identify priorities for strengthening CSS. This can also serve to establish as a baseline and then be a means to identify indicators for future monitoring. And the second is strengthen capacity building approaches. So in addition to continuing ongoing capacity building initiatives such as the Safeguards Learning Centers that were established under the joint COP on safeguards, there is a need to develop new approaches to build project level safeguards capacity at DMCs based on priority sectors identified in the previous step at the country programming strategy level. So if a priority areas are identified there, then capacity building should also be focused on those agencies. Then in order to mainstream safeguards good practice into CSS institutional and legal reform are needed. And this requires long-term engagement, as we see from RDA, that there has to be a lot of long-term engagement, identifying gaps, and then slowly over time, the agency can then take it forward with their government to bring about changes. So dialogue on these can also begin again at the CPS stage and then be monitored for priority sectors. So I'll continue with this lesson, with the lessons learned on the next slide. So can we have the next slide, please? So how can we do this? So progressively strengthen the CSS by linking safeguards outcomes with financing modalities. So as I just mentioned, that long-term engagement to achieve legal reforms can be done through policy-based lending. So this provides a very good opportunity to converge national systems towards good practices for safeguards through policy enhancements. Another financing modality which can be used is the results-based lending, which applies CSS at the level of a program with ADB safeguards as a compliance benchmark. So if there's a program, then we assess that, and a program action plan is prepared. And so the program is then reviewed, and if there are any gaps between the national system which the program would be using and the SPS, then those gaps can be filled at the level of that program. And this can then be a means to progressively build safeguards capacity at the level of that institution which is implementing that RBL, and improve practice in introducing systems over time. Another approach, which is, as I just explained a little earlier, is what the World Bank is doing, is that that CSS can be explored at the project level 1 and at the level of standards. So, so this can be done by considering methods for achieving material or functional consistency, similar to what the World Bank, AIIB or IDB are doing, but with a focus on achieving safeguards outcomes to address specific project risks. And so what about the standard level, as I just mentioned? So here is another area that could be explored, and that also can be based on the World Bank experience, although that's very limited. It's just been, I think, done in a case, maybe 2 cases, and maybe another one. That is what the World Bank did, was they used national labor laws after relevant international organizations through their reporting said that that particular country was successfully implementing their national labor laws. So based on that, the World Bank is then started using the country's labor laws instead of their labor standard. So in this way, a standard by standard gradual approach could also be considered for certain standards. So in each of these cases, though, we have to bear in mind that there will be gaps, but gap filling actions and capacity needs can then be linked to the project through legal agreements and then be monitored through the project. And then, of course, for the next projects, then that we can see how that has been achieved. So here I'll end my part of the presentation, and I'll hand it over to Gelson, who will be Gelson Garcia, who will be taking the discussion forward and sharing some questions. And I hope that this overview provided by Bruce and the details of the projects and our challenges will help you give the context to have a good discussion on the next questions. Thank you. Gelson.
Hi, Zara. Yes, good morning. I'll turn you over back to Azim, because he's going to walk us through what we have to do next before my turn.
Sorry about that. Okay.
Azim?
Thank you very much for that, Gelson. And thank you, Zara. Sorry, my screen has frozen. I hope you're still able to see me on the screen, or at least hear me. But I wanted to thank you for that presentation, Zara. And as Gelson said, Gelson will be prompting us with guide questions after the break. But just to offer thanks for the provision of the clarity and feedback and some of the comparative processes related to country safeguard systems, and in particular the objective of how the ADB can help borrowers and clients strengthen their safeguard systems and develop the capacities necessary to manage the various types of risks and the acceptability and equivalency principles which you spoke about. I'd also like to thank Director Bruce Dunn for framing and contextualizing the discussion. And we hope we can get further feedback from you on what the ADB should consider in these general policy topics and areas during the facilitated Q&A session. The session will run for about 75 minutes, but there is some flexibility in that. But before we go to that Q&A, let's now pause for a brief 5-minute break. Before we actually break for the break, if that makes any sense, can I please invite you all to think about our poll evaluation that we will be having a little bit later on. If you wish to register your written feedback on how to improve our consultation approach, the link to offer your suggestions, your contributions, your constructive criticisms appears in the chat box now. And the link is on an app called menti.com, which is posted in the chat box. So specifically, we would like to know how to better engage, solicit feedback, and allow participants like yourselves to share feedback, ask questions, and engage in the consultations that we are hosting. As Bruce Dunn and myself mentioned, this is now our 13th consultation. We still have at least seven, perhaps a few more consultations remaining. So we would like to know how to specifically improve these. So during our break, if you can let us know, we'd be very grateful. What we're going to do now is take a brief 5-minute break. You will see on the slide that's now on your screen, we have the 3 guide questions that Gelson will be taking us through. We also have a countdown timer in the top right-hand corner. And when that countdown timer reaches 0, you'll know that it's time to return to your screens. We will also have some background music playing, which will give you an indication when that background music starts to fade away, that it's time to return to the screen. So please, while you're enjoying your tea or coffee or whatever beverage you're about to take during the break, please remember the question that we're asking, and we'll have an opportunity to respond to that question either now or after the consultation ends for about 2 hours. But for now, let's take a break, and we'll see you back on your screens in about 5 minutes. Thank you, and see you soon. Thanks very much, and welcome back, everybody. We will now have the country safeguard system study discussions as facilitated by Gelson Garcia, as I mentioned, with Ms. Zara Abbas's and Bruce Dunn's contexts in mind. Let's now turn it over to Gelson Garcia, who will take questions in this order. First, advanced questions, and secondly, questions asked live through the raising hand function using the reaction button on the Zoom screen, and thirdly, through questions posted in the chat box. Gelson will prompt us with guide questions that were flashed on the screen during our break, and a reminder that you may ask questions in English, Chinese, Bahasa, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese. Please then join us for a quick event evaluation before turning you back to Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap up and the next steps following the consultation. So let's start without any further delay. Mr. Garcia, over to you, please.
Thank you, Azim. Good morning, everybody. We are now in the important part of the consultation, which is the moderated Q&A. This is the session when ADB will be in a listening mode when it's time for your voices to get heard. We have approximately 75 minutes for listening and circling back to comments. While you're formulating your questions and comments, I just want to quickly highlight 3 important points to guide our discussion. First, this first of the 5 consultations on CSS has the government stakeholders from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Combined, these 3 regions have 33 member countries that comprise 67% of ADB's 49 regional member countries. I was looking yesterday at the 2021 annual report. These 3 regions had about half of ADB's total lending commitments in 2020 across many sectors of development financing, from infrastructure to public sector management, health, education, and natural resources, with the use of different financing modalities. Now, our registration shows we have 19 countries from these 3 regions represented by 61 participants, while we are also joined by government and other civil society stakeholders from other regions. As the topic deals with the strengthening of and the approach to using CSS, it's time to hear from you, the executing agencies, implementing agencies, and other stakeholders in the implementation of these development projects. We'd like to hear about the challenges and results of applying ADB's safeguard requirements as they apply to your countries that also have relevant, if not potentially equivalent or acceptable laws, regulations, and agency mechanisms. In short, your own country systems. Second, we sent you 3 questions last week as part of the consultation materials for your pre-read. We hope you had the time to think through these questions before our session. As flashed on your screen, these questions are: what are the advantages and disadvantages of the SPS or safeguards policy statement approach to the use of country safeguard systems? And what are your recommendations for the new policy? Second, how could ADB better work with its clients and affected communities and civil society organizations to strengthen CSS and the capacity to use it? And 3, are there good practices outside of multilateral financial institutions that ADB should be looking at with respect to country safeguard systems? Now, to help us respond to your comments, we have Director Bruce Dunn and Zara Abbas, who presented earlier, to address them. And then we are also joined by ADB experts and practitioners, including Mr. Ricky Barba, the Principal Safeguard Specialist, who leads ADB's safeguards implementation in the South Asia Department. Then Ms. Madhumita Gupta and Ms. Irina Novikova, both principal social development specialist will also help address your comments. And third, we have simple mechanics if you wish to make intervention. Raise your hand by clicking the raise hand icon on the lower right of the Zoom, or write your comments in chat box. Also, if you wish to send your questions anonymously, you can directly or privately send them to me or to my colleague Jennifer or Josh. And if you feel more comfortable speaking in the language of your choice, we have Bahasa Indonesia, Chinese, Khmer, Lao, and Vietnamese interpreters to assist you. So, all right, let's get the ball rolling. Who would like to start, please? Okay, so there's no hands raised. So allow me then to encourage many of you who are still formulating your questions to really come in. I note that in our list of registration, we have the Indonesia government that has the largest contingent here. And I think this is a suitable time to actually hopefully hear from them, because Indonesia is one of the 3 countries where the CSS had been piloted, and we particularly have representatives from the Indonesia State Electricity Company, or PLN, and we also have representatives from the Ministry of Finance and Bappenas, or the Development Planning Ministry of Indonesia. So we hope to hear from you. Okay, I see one hand raised already. So we have Mada Dahana Bap. So over to you, Mr. Bapa Dahana. Salamat pagi, Pak. So it's your turn, please. If you could also quickly introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gracia. Selamat pagi. My name is Mada Dahana from National Development Agency, or Bappenas. Yeah, actually, I'm following this issue of SPS updating, since we have some issues in our portfolio project regarding of the policies. So I think in line with your 3 guidance question, for the question, I would like to answer that what are the advantage and disadvantage of the SPS approach to SSCSS, and what our recommendations for the new policy. Well, actually, we are welcoming ADB's plan on the upgrading of upgrading the SPS policy. We understand that the SPS policy are aimed to achieve the overall benefit of any development projects or programs in cooperation with ADB. But however, the main question is actually how should we prepare to comply with the ADB SPSS? What are actually the requirements? It is still not clear to us. Does this SPS can be as pragmatic as a list of requirements to comply, or does it a narrative concept which will be detailed or breakdown later in the project implementations? The reasons for that is that now the line ministry or the executing agency they always make this kind of argument that they are not in the court to comply on all the requirement in SPS, which some of them are often beyond what they have prepared for. So for the number 1, we suggest that ADB can provide the detailed list of SPS requirement, or at least in the form of templates, and put categorization on the mandatory requirement and the less important ones. And for number 2, how could ADB better work with its clients and affected communities and CSOs to strengthen CSS and the capacity to use it? ADB can work with the CSO, according to us, to harmonize the ADB SPS with the country system. So with the CSO, you can find which are the already synchronized regulations, which are the gaps, and which are the contradictory issues or regulations. We would welcome such endeavor endeavors, but on the view of overall regulatory improvements, not specific to a project. So please also work with the CSO to strengthen the country's safeguard system. And for the number 3, are there good practices outside of other multilateral financing institutions that ADB should be looking with respect to country's safeguard system? Well, actually, as far as I know, that the SPS on ADB or other multilateral development bank generally is the most rigid ones. On the contrary, on that questions, I understand that SPS is abating on multilateral development banks. How do you think to apply the SPS to other FIs, financial institutions, such as all the development, such as the bilateral development agencies or other financial institutions? I ask this since there is now tendency with our executing agencies or the line ministry to avoid using the MDB fund due to the complexity of the SPS policy. So the unintended consequences are that somehow this make this MDB financing instrument could be less competitive than those outside this ADB or multilateral development banks. So I think that is the my response about your 3 guideline question, Mr. Gracia. Thank you.
Terima kasih, Bapak Madadahana. That's good. So you have clearly laid out your responses to the 3 questions, and you actually get back with a question also to my ADB colleagues. So I would like to call Ms. Zara Abbas to respond in the first instance, and after her, perhaps we can have Mr. Ricky Barba or Bruce Dunn to come in. I think the questions coming from you are, what actually are the requirements to comply with the CSS before it is applied? And you suggested some detailed requirements or template for countries to comply with the CSS requirements, including when this needs to be synchronized with the ADB safeguard. So when there are gaps, how can this mesh gaps be filled? And it's also, you have question about the use of CSS in other financial institutions, considering that it might be more competitive for them to use that as opposed to MDB standard. So let me now call Ms. Zara Abbas first.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to answer the question a little bit from a step behind, but if we, I think as I understand it, is that what you're trying to, what you're asking is that how can the provisions be applied? So under the current SPS, yes, as we just explained, yes, the provisions were complex and it was a very difficult process. So under what we're aiming to do with the new policy is move towards a policy framework which will be more, which will have more guidance, which will be clearer, which will have more clarity, and it will be easier for our DMCs and for the partners to understand the requirements and then implement those requirements. So that is one thing that we're planning to do, which will be different in the new policy. And then for under the current SPS, the requirement of equivalence was very cumbersome, and it was seen that it was very difficult to achieve equivalence with the national system with the policy because of the complexity of the national system as well as the complexity of the SPS. So moving towards a system, we were trying to seek your opinions on how can we move towards something which is less cumbersome and something which can have more, could help us meet the outcomes or safeguards outcomes. So as I'm not clear about the question, but I didn't understand the question very well. But if you can just guide me, I can expand on what exactly what you're looking at under the current system, because the current system we're planning to change and move to something which is more pragmatic and doable. Pakdaha, is that, Nahana, is that, does that answer your question, or I can clarify if.
Okay, thank you. So you say that the next SPS approach will have a pragmatic approach and will provide at least the detailed requirement that doable, and so that the clients or us, the line ministry or the executive agency, will be easier to follow and to prepare in advance to comply with the SPSS policy. So I think it's a good development. Then we are very supportive that if that is the goal of the SPSS update. Thank you, Bu Abbas. Yeah.
So just building on that, we're also moving towards a risk-based approach where, well, risks will be identified in advance, and then we will move towards how to fill those, how to address those risks depending on the type of the risk and as part of the due diligence. So it will be easier to understand, also easier to follow. If you like, Bruce, would you like to add something to explain more if you want, if you think? Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Zara. Yeah, I'll just add very briefly. Thank you very much, Mada. Really appreciate you joining today from Bapanas. Firstly, I wanted to acknowledge the key point that you mentioned at the end, that if the ADB policy requirements are overly complex or not clear, that is a disincentive to working in collaboration with the ADB, which is, of course, not what we would like to see. What we need to work through in this policy update process is how we can be very clear on the policy principles and requirements. And then something that we've actually been honestly criticized for through the evaluation of ADB's existing policy is not having enough clarity, not having enough guidance, templates and support to our clients and borrowers like yourself. So that's certainly something that we need to work through. It is, though, likely that ADB will still, though, have to maintain a policy that is consistent across all of our developing member countries. And what that tends to mean in practice is that there may be differences between the Indonesian country system or the Vietnamese country system and what ADB requires. And something we need to do much more systematically, really at a country portfolio level, plus the project level, but even before we get to the project level, is to understand what are those differences, and what would that actually mean to implementation at the country level, and how we might be able to go about addressing those. Are there things, are those areas where the government might themselves like to be able to strengthen practice and would like to request support from ADB, or is that something that's embedded in the national legal framework, and that as a basis for ADB financing, we might have to then backfill or address at a project level? But I guess the point is we have to be very clear and understand the cost and the implications of that so that we can then find a way to work together. I think we'll probably have more discussions on some of those points from other colleagues. So I'll stop there now, but welcome your further thoughts and that from others. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Mada, do you have any follow-up question to that, to Bruce?
Okay, no, then I will follow this the discussion later. Okay, thank you.
Yes, and I think your question actually is a very fundamental set of questions. So let me take this opportunity also to call on Mr. Ricky Barba so that we can also hear from their comparative experience in the pilot use of CSS in India and Sri Lanka. Ricky, I can put you on the spot, right? So what has been your experience in the region when it comes to dealing with these similar questions, gap filling measures and support to increase the capacity of governments, please?
Right. Thank you very much, Gelson. So I hope you can hear me. And if you can hear me, I'd also like to respond specifically to one of our colleagues from to one of the specific questions of our colleague from Bapinas. I actually quite like the points that he made on his second question on the involvement of CSOs. And that has been integral in our conduct of the country's safeguard systems, that CSOs have a role in pointing out potential differences, I think the word that he used was, let me try to look at for my notes, contradictory policies maybe. I think it's very important, and that's actually the essence of consultation. And we are consulting with CSOs as well. So thank you for that comment. In general, I agree with you. These are also the views that we get from South Asia, that an update of the SPS should be clearer, more pragmatic. And I also like, your comment on an overly complex SPS tends to drive agencies away from ADB, and that is unfortunate. But I think what needs to be seen here is that, working in South Asia, I've also been getting feedback from our governments that there are instances where they actually pick ADB because of the robustness of the policy. Say they want to deal with something where government policies are not very clear, then they actually prefer ADB. But of course, that's a government to government difference. That's an opinion of one of the governments of South Asia, which may not be the same as all governments. But I do recognize that there is an importance to have very clear policies, one that can be implemented. And one of the things we work on in South Asia is to actually ensure project readiness. And that actually helps with safeguards requirements, because a lot of the things that make a project ready are concerned with safeguards as well, whether the plans are already there and very clear and all advanced actions are already there. So let me stop on that point. And if Sir would have a follow-up, I'd gladly resume. Thanks, Jelson.
Thanks, Ricky. And Mada, please do come in a little later if you have additional burning questions or recommendations to make. So this is actually for government stakeholders like you in the region. So we look forward to hearing from you again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I will now call Mr. Ian Hagarty. Mr. Ian, it's good to have you again. You just joined us last week on the Fragile and Conflict Affected Situation SEEDS consultation. So it's your turn, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And terima kasih banyak to Pak Mada for the very good points that he raised. Everyone hearing me okay?
Yep.
I presume so. Yes, I see a nodding head. Thank you, Bruce. First of all, an introduction. My name's Ian Haggerty. I've worked both as an ADB TA and other TAs in the Pacific. My primary focus is Vanuatu. I'm a naturalized citizen from Vanuatu, and I am an EIA reviewer. So I get to see the outputs of some of these projects that we're discussing the policies about. So I see these things in practice. First of all, I want to thank the ADB for two things. One, your openness to consult on this sort of initiative. I think it's very brave. Most people don't do that, and thank you very much for the opportunity. Secondly, as I've mentioned, it is a Pacific perspective, and I want to thank you for the great support and indeed the advancement that has occurred in the Pacific region through the ADB support, both as a result of SPS and related. So thank you very much. You are making a difference to safeguards. Thirdly, in response to Ricky's point about risk, and yes, 100% agree, risk-based is very important, is scalability of risks. And may I also suggest, which I'm sure many of us won't disagree, that the risks on projects nowadays, because you have tried and tested techniques, you have testing for quality of concrete and steel, etc., that these are overwhelmingly safeguards. That is the highest level of risk on pretty much all projects. So that's one point I'd like to add. So I appreciate often safeguards is the tail wagging a dog, but ultimately the dog cares most about its tail than any other part of it, or I would recommend that it does. I'm not surprised that there are challenges on the policy side. We have a centralized policy from a centralized organization, ADB, trying to impose on a project basis, and there's no loaded language there, its policies on safeguards, which, as Zara pointed out, are very often dispersed, and they certainly are in Pacific countries, with other policies and other imperatives, policy imperatives in the recipient countries. So it's unsurprising that the policy level work that you set off with the best intentions of achieving hasn't necessarily worked. So that's certainly one point. And I would suggest that if we're talking about evidence-based policy, then the evidence is inherent in the results of the projects, not equivalence analysis, not whether a project has used it or not, but what the actual mitigation and avoidance of impacts have been on the ground. And I would suggest that we roll things up a bit more to inform future policy to see what has worked and what hasn't worked. So I would recommend, if we can, and I know it's resource hungry, to go down a little bit deeper. Just one, so these are more just observations than anything else. But what I've observed is that there is a policy clash at country level. And a lot of it, and Jean Williams refers to this as back office versus front office. And a lot of back office ADB documentation swamps countries, particularly smaller, poorly resourced countries in the Pacific. And I would ask you to think of that and what the outputs of your policy implementation are and what that might mean to the people who have to do the work in the countries, that is the implementing agencies rather than the executing agencies. I'll leave it at that, and I'd love to hear other people's views, and it was a great start to the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. So I think I'm not going to repeat questions that you made. It's quite clear, although you mentioned something about the scalability, the challenge of these safeguards appearing to be some kind of imposition, and you mentioned about the word policy clash. So let's hear from Bruce, and then I'll also follow up with Ricky also later for his experience in South Asia, how ADB has dealt with this institutionally and at the country level. So Bruce, over to you, please.
Great, thank you, Delson. Thank you so much, Ian, for joining again from the consultations last week, and glad to have you here today. A few really great points, really insightful, and I tend to agree with the issues, all of the points that you've raised. It wasn't so much questions, more as, you know, insights, observations, and recommendations, but I'll kind of comment on a couple of them. Firstly, I think you're right. As a multilateral financial institution, we do come with a set of policies, which is an imposition on the countries. And I think we have to acknowledge that. That's something that our board, being made up of developing and developed member countries, comes forward and says, look, we'd like to have a consistent policy that meets international, or a definition of international good practice, and apply that across the board in every country that we work in. And that's challenging because the legal frameworks, the capacities that are there across the region are different. And you need to apply it in very different project contexts as well, ones that have you know, more significant risks and others that are fairly negligible in terms of the risks and can be addressed through good management practices rather than a whole lot of additional work. So I think that's something that we have to kind of understand and tackle. And as we bring forward a new policy, of course, our board members will again be looking for us to have a sort of a strong, fairly large scope of the policy. And we then need to find a way through that's essentially practical. You know, your point, and also to Mr. Dana from Bapanas as well. We need clarity, we need simplicity. We don't need a lot of extraneous requirements when they're not necessary. So, you know, we need to find that sort of balance between those two areas. Coming to that also, I would agree very much your point about sort of, there's equivalence, trying to find the sort of legal equivalence, which is the track that we've gone down often. As we've been looking, ADB has this policy which we're seeking to apply in all of our countries. And then we're looking for this sort of exact terminology that we find in our policy in someone else's legal framework, which has been written in their context, in their language. I think one of the experiences that we've come to understand is, that's not helpful. Should we expect to find equivalence? Maybe not. Should we be focusing more on what is the actual outcome? And I think that's something that, while it's not so clearly defined, World Bank, AIIB now talking, rather than the terminology equivalence, have moved to sort of material consistency with a focus on the outcomes that are likely to be achieved at a project level. And to try and understand that, I think you have to drill down much more in terms of the actual experience on the ground. How have past projects been implemented? What were the issues? What are likely the risks that would need to be addressed? And then come at it a bit more from that angle. Of course, you still have to understand the legal frameworks. You're not going to throw that out, but you're going to have to focus more. And actually, that's something I think the civil society has been very much pushing on as well. Trying to see that, the case studies, that type of experience. So I'll stop there. But I think you raise a number of important issues that we have to try and work through, although not always an easy solution given sort of, what our board expects us to see in terms of policy, and then how we can find a simple and practical way down at implementation levels. But, we're hearing stakeholders and we're trying to find some way through there. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Ricky, would you like to come in here? Because I know that this is also an ongoing study for ADB. This is also has been part of the so-called community of practice discussion. So please come in.
Yes, thank you. I think the points that Ian raised are very relevant. And it's unfortunate that the presentation is compressed, because actually a lot of those lessons have been learned from the experience. And we didn't pick on those things, which is good, because we can maybe say this up front. When you talk about the outcomes, I do agree with that. And first of all, let's talk about diversity of the countries in the regional department. I think South Asia is one that has the most diversity, because we're dealing with, for example, with a large country like India, with very clear, policies, directions, etc. Then we also have something maybe more close to the Pacific Islands, like the Maldives. Clearly, that will be, night and day. Yet you're applying the same policy, right? So I do understand that. When I think Bruce has talked about the equivalence and how difficult it is, but that was the structure of SPS. And I think our experience on acceptability, speaks to the point that you have raised as well on outcomes. For example, in Sri Lanka, it really depends on what lens you look at it. Some say, okay, so your only success is in power grid for South Asia, in the bank, actually, where you have an agreed country safeguard systems that's actually applied to your projects. But I don't agree. I think Sri Lanka was equally successful as India. For example, you talk about outcomes. One of the outcomes there was improving the manual on roadkill. So this was for the Roads Development Authority. They found that one of the things that they dealt with all the time was roadkill. Of course, with a very diverse flora and fauna. Fauna specifically in Sri Lanka, you have significant roadkill, and it could be very, very important types of fauna. And so that is an outcome that they wanted to ensure, that you have to the maximum avoidance of roadkill. We help them in the manual that comes as part of their directives in terms of implementation of environmental management. And so I think that was a big success. So I think that we are heading in the right direction. Your views are, very important to incorporate. And I think much of that has already been also seen. So where the direction goes to in terms of project versus CSS, because I think I also read the question that you raised, and there should be a relationship between project outcomes and CSS. Mm-hmm. And in fact, when you do projects, as you know, you're an EIA reviewer. if you have an EIA that ADB finds acceptable, that should have had a very robust treatment of the legislation, you know, the guidelines, and what the system is in the country, and how the project will address gaps as well. So that is, so CSS can help define that better. In fact, in Sri Lanka, because of all the work that's been done, we're now looking at projects based on what we know. There's no need to rewrite that section. There are also very clear advantages that are already in the system that we can replicate, for example, in grievance redress. I can say a lot more, but I don't think I have enough time. But yes, we encourage continuing discussion. I think this is a very relevant area. Let me stop at that. Back to Gelson.
Thanks, Ricky. We have two questions actually, but I wondered if Ian, would you like to have some quick response to that, or you will come next?
Just a little. Okay. Just a little, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. Ricky, thank you very much. Bruce, thank you very much. And again, thank you for your approachability. Good to know that there's a lot more in the background. For example, we find the IEEs typically required by ADB are pretty high quality, and those combined with the management controls work rather well to have some good outcomes. So you know, it's not a big criticism. The other is my mind's boggling over roadkill in Sri Lanka and elephants, seeing elephants crossing a road there. I dread to see roadkill like that, I must say. But it is good to see those, shall we say, I hesitate to say, but something like Western responses, like road corridors, wildlife corridors, and so on, starting to slip in. We're finding some social ones slipping in as well, like speed bumps with space for utilities that haven't even been introduced to rural communities, things like that. I think we need to share those. Quite how with something as vast and as varied as ADB, I don't know, but that's where your policies end up. And that's where you can actually rest you can wear your medals with pride, is those good things, you know, rather than constantly having the policy clashes and the high level difficulty of getting governments to agree. They can't even agree internally, let alone with people like yourselves. So good luck. Thank you, Ricky. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Ian. I don't think you will require an immediate answer to that, no? So I think let's just say it's well noted and recorded. All right, then. So we have two questions where the source does not want to be identified, and we allow that in this consultation to enable free and open conversation. So I'm going to read the first question. This is with regards to the experience in the Philippines. The biggest disadvantage we have with the SPS approach and CSS is that most of the laws mandates here in the Philippines overlap with each other. For example, take legislation involving indigenous peoples. We have IPRA, or the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, or RA 10066, and the Local Government Code. Each can have a different appreciation based on the context. It's not just gaps we are challenged with, but overlaps as well. Can I ask Irina to address this question, not necessarily on the Philippines, but what has been the experience so far when it comes to the application of social safeguards in countries where they have their own respective laws regarding local governance and indigenous people? Irina?
Thank you, Gelson, and thanks a lot for this question. I think this is a very important question, and our experience shows that this is a little bit of an uphill battle when we do CSS assessments for equivalence. And I completely appreciate the difficulties of doing CSS in this context, because what our experience shows is that they can be, absolutely, they can be different overlaps at the legislation at the national level. At the same time, there can be also some quite contradictory overlaps between national and subnational level legislations. And depending on the country that we are talking about, they can be sort of federal level, almost federal level legislation and state level legislation, or regional provincial legislation that can be with odds in odds with the national legislation. In addition to that, I think we need to be cognizant of the administrative jurisdictions of the agencies that we are talking about. For a very interesting case in Indonesia would be the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Forestry versus the jurisdiction of the land agency, which creates its own complexities on the ground when it comes to the geographical coverage of various laws and regulations attached to those laws. So I would completely agree with the commenter that this presents a challenge, and it becomes quite an important task to understand these contexts, to understand how the overlapping happens, how contradictions are captured, and also what is the net result of that legislation, pretty much. And it's quite difficult to actually come up with these conclusions, because we need to have very solid legal advice. And what ADB does, we work with a legal team. We have international experts, and we also have national legal experts that kind of help us to hammer down on these net outcomes in the end. And this has been our approach so far. But I think going forward, it's quite important that we will still have this understanding at the country level, sort of have this bird's eye of the national system and various laws and regulations and potential contradictions that exist in the legal framework, to have this assessment that will inform what to expect. But I think if we move forward towards sort of outcome-oriented system to material consistency, or to look at the implementation, sort of achieving the results of the principles that will be ingrained in the standards. So I think that bird's level is important, but it will also be quite important to scale it to the level of the project, potentially to look at the context, as the commenter also said, that's quite interesting and that's applicable. So from that perspective, not the whole country system may apply, but in the context of the project, perhaps it will be much easier to understand what contradictions we may face. That's all for me. I'm not sure if Ricky or Bruce would like to say a few words on this. Over to you, Jocelyn. Thank you.
Thanks, Irina. I think one key word that I get from you is we're trying to scale it down at the level of the project. So thanks. Ricky, would you like to come in here? Because not only that you're from the Philippines, but given your experience in other regions, or especially in South Asia, where you're dealing with many indigenous groups or scheduled tribes in India, how has ADB been dealing with the question of policy overlap, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Jelson. First, let me also clarify that I think Irina made a very important point. Irina practically covered the whole thing. But she made the important point that while, as you noted, there should also be a look at the project level, she also underlined the importance of having, the context in the national level. And everything that Irina said is everything we experienced when we were working on South Asia, that you will find things that are contradictory. And then I am not a legal expert, but you need to also understand what is the legislation. Sometimes no contradiction, then suddenly you have case law that actually when it's implemented, it ends up with a different outcome. But I think this is what makes country safeguard system an effort that needs to be continued under SPS. This is my personal view, because can you imagine without this kind of assessment implementing an ADB project? And I'm not going to talk about the Philippine context. And yes, I'm Filipino, but that is not my expertise, unfortunately, IPs in the Philippines. But when these things are seen, these contradictions are actually some things that ADB might down the road be able to help with in terms of clarifying, in terms of understanding what the impacts of these contradictions. And then look at the ADB project as the framework or the spine, right? This is the spine with which we implement a project to ensure that the outcomes are placed in the right direction. So whether that contradiction has to be interpreted and therefore, this is the one that is aligned with SPS and implemented in a project, I think that remains a very important thing. And again, I work in South Asia where the age of the policies are different. Some policies end up not being so perfect once it's launched, but over time, I think this is the value of CSS also, to point out where improvements can be made. And at the project level, what is the capacity? And Irina pointed out a very important things. Some contradictions don't actually happen at the project level because of jurisdiction. Say we're implementing project X and the conflict is between agency A and agency B, but agency B has no mandate on this project. So we only consider actually, agency A's policy as it applies to project X. So sorry for using all the codes, but I wouldn't want to be specific, but really I think there is an importance to this question in us looking at how to direct how CSS will be undertaken in the future. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Ricky. So recognizing the complexities of dealing with this at the country and project level, this is now a question to Zara. So institutionally, Zara, what's the future direction in dealing with this overlap?
Exactly, this is what I wanted to say, that this points to the need of having an outcomes approach, looking at things at the objective level and to see how are safeguards outcomes being met. So I think this would solve the problems when we come to looking at it from that angle, to make sure that when there are contradictions, but at the end, are we achieving the overall outcomes or not? So that's, I just wanted to close there because I think the discussion is very detailed, and Irina and Ricky have done a very good job in explaining it from the IP angle. But overall on the policy level, yes, that would be the direction.
All right then. So let's continue this very engaging discussion. I'll now turn to another question. The source doesn't want to be mentioned also, but here's a very relevant question. And this question goes to Bruce first. Is safeguards assessment mandatory for policy-based loans or PBL? This is one of the financing modalities which was earlier mentioned in the presentation. As we know, policy-based loan has minimal interaction with aspects that are assessed by safeguards teams, such as environmental aspects, the evictions in indigenous people. This characteristic is different from the project loan, which has a direct interaction with these three aspects. Thank you. Bruce?
Great, thank you, Dilson, and thanks very much for that comment, that question regarding policy-based lending. So the first thing to mention here is, like with all projects, we do screen and categorize policy-based lending based on the potential adverse impacts and risks that it could have on the environment and on people. So the safeguard policy does apply. Then secondly, we have to understand that policy-based lending is intended by its very nature to be different in comparison to what we might be doing with, say, project level investments, where we build things, civil works focused. Policy-based lending is intended to support policy reforms, so the development of new policies, laws, regulations, or enabling conditions that support then the implementation of those. But we're very clear actually, and we try to screen the design of a policy-based lending program quite carefully to make sure that it doesn't include direct investments for things that would have a direct physical change. So ADB financing is not directly finding its way down onto the ground to support investments. However, of course, policy reforms can still have impacts, and this is something we have to carefully look at. So the process is there is a what we call a policy matrix that will basically look at each individual policy reform area, so what's proposed to be reformed by the government, and then we'll look at the potential environmental and social impacts. And there can be issues, for example, a policy reform program that might make changes to land laws, land regulations that could have, for example, implications to the way land is allocated or could stimulate. For example, a policy-based program that might look at stimulating agricultural production for food security could have adverse impacts on the coverage of natural habitats in the country if there's not specific provisions in the law to address those. So these issues are actually screened for, and then mitigation measures at the level of the policy or the legal reform program would then be proposed. So again, we're not proposing project level mitigation. We'd be saying, you know, does something in the design of this law need to be revised, or the policy implementation framework to address the safeguard risks that have been identified? So, you know, it's a similar process of assessing potential impacts, developing mitigation measures in the context of the program, but it's quite different because your focus is on policies, not on actual projects. Now, I'll stop there. I hope that's sort of covered the scope of the question, but please feel free, you know, to come back. You know, you can channel again directly to my colleague Gelson if you've got further follow-up questions you'd like to ask. Thank you.
Maybe Bruce, like either you or Zara, I know that it's not just ADB that has adopted the policy-based loans and how it can be linked with the CSS. Peer MFIs such as the World Bank also have the development policy loan. What has ADB been learning from this? Maybe Zara can respond.
Do you want to go ahead, Zara, speaking a little bit more about the potential future and linkage to CSS?
Yeah, I can. One possibility could be that if, but then say we do an overview assessment or an assessment of what the gaps are, or what the areas are for improvement. And rather than just look at it from early engagement with the governments and identifying what are the priority sectors, like for instance, like South Asia Department identifies that for a certain country, the transport sector has a lot of potential and there's a heavy portfolio coming along in the next 4 to 5 years. And the government has the commitment to work on safeguards and has demonstrated in the past that there's a lot of interest in that and have been working on that in these aspects, and also identified that there are certain legal gaps in the national policy that also are, they find also as hurdles. So once these are identified upstream, then as part of an ongoing project or a new project could be developed around a policy, which could be a policy, the gap that's already identified could become part of a policy loan, and that could be something that could be agreed with the government that, okay, this is if this policy gap is filled, then this you know, it could be financing linked to policy implementation in the future. So that could be one area but that requires long-term engagement where you've been working with the client and have an understanding of what the laws are and what are the problems that they're facing with the gaps that they have in their law. But so if that's done, then in that manner, the CSS could also, the gaps could also be filled through a policy loan. So that could be one way to do it. It's a bit long and but a little bit complex.
Thanks, Zara and Madhu. I just want to note that we have about 10 to 15 minutes for the this Q&A. So I encourage everyone in the room who haven't spoken yet to please come in. This is for you. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I just want to recognize the representation from Cambodia. I know that we have representatives from the Ministry of Economy and Finance. From Fiji also, we have from the Ministry of Land, Waste Authority of Fiji, Fiji Roads Authority, please come in. From Kiribati, from the Ministry of Environment, Land and Natural Resources, Lao PDR. Mongolia, we have a representative from the municipality of Ulaanbaatar, where ADB has a ongoing project there. Ministry of Finance in Mongolia is also here. From Papua New Guinea, Department of Public Works and Highways, a lot of infrastructure-focused agencies. Then, yes, we have representatives from the Philippines, the Environmental Management Bureau, also Samoa. They have a large contingent here, 5 of them. And Solomon Islands, you have 9. Tonga, 2. Tuvalu, and also from Vietnam. So we have huge resources in the room who may want to share their experience. Okay. Okay, good. So please do come in. And also, if some of you, there are areas that you think ADB should focus on in terms of assisting strengthening country system, and if so, what would be your priorities? This is a question specifically to our government stakeholders. And maybe while waiting for others, I just want to ask maybe Bruce again or Zara, beyond the MFIs, have there been other institutions or government where you have identified to have what we call potential to be materially consistent or functionally equivalent in the region? Because I know that some people might be asking, why are we looking at the MFIs? What about others? Okay. You can skip that question for now because we have an additional question from Pa Mada Dahana. Pa Dahana, please.
Okay, thank you, Garcia, Mr. Garcia. Actually, there's a interesting issue about this contradictory regulation between IDB, SPS, and the government. Probably in our experience, sometimes what we found is not a hard contradiction, but it's maybe a soft contradiction. It means like this. Actually, now the government is already make some significant improvement, try to comply with this safeguard system. So for instance, in the land acquisition issues, so previously the government only compensate people for the land acquisition who has a legal basis previously. But now, but ADB wants that not only people who has a legal basis that compensated, but also people who does not a legal basis. And the government has already made a progression about that. And but to avoid the speculation, to avoid the speculative action, they put a requirement that the people who the people can be compensated without legal basis if they already occupy the land for at least 10 years. But then the ADB insists that it's not necessarily 10 years. So probably 1 or 2 years, they are already entitled for land compensation. So this kind of, I call it a soft contradiction that in the technical issues that yet unsolved between the line ministries, the executive agency and the ADB. That's some, and there is a lot of them. There is a lot of issues in the technical details that can create problems and find stumbled in the project implementation. That's I think that's the situation, because as far as I'm concerned, there is no more hard contradictory regulatory issues between ADB, SPS, and government policy, but still there is many soft contradictory regulation or issue between ADB, SPS, and the government. Maybe we have to pay attention or focus to address these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Pa. It's good that you actually qualify that yes, there are contradictions, but some of them are not necessarily hard or tough contradictions. Some of these are soft, which means they can also be remedied or addressed through gut feeling measures. So I think this is the time to actually hear from Ricky again, and after that, Irina, and how practically, operationally have we dealt with these soft contradictions in some of the pilot CSS that you have done in South Asia?
Yes. I was actually going to say I wish I worked in Indonesia, because in other countries, I think that is still a hard contradiction. So I think the approach of the government is correct, basically recognizing that not only people who have titles should be compensated or have entitlement, but I do understand the point. So how CSS would work under the old system is that there would be a gap filling measure. So basically, let's say this is rule X, right? That if you have been resident, or you can prove residence for 10 years, I've seen various versions of this regulation. If you can show 10 years of proof of staying there, then you will be entitled. That's good. Definitely ADB does not see any contradiction in that. So the problem is those that have been occupants from year 0 to 9, right? Or year 0, 9.99. So that would have to have a gap filling measure. And I don't want to go into policy, but as everyone who's probably worked on an ADB project will understand, the issue here is that, is there a livelihood or a way of life being affected? And that is not necessarily for those who just have stayed for 10 years. It could be the same for someone who has stayed 9 years, or maybe there are different gradients which would still require compensation. So in CSS, this is something that needs to be worked on. This is where capacity can be built. This is where legislation can be refined. These are the kinds of support under a new, presumably under a new SPS and the CSS section of it. And I'm sorry if I am overstepping Bruce and Zara's domain. I do not wish to influence the direction, but this is how presumably this could be handled moving forward. Thank you.
That's fine, Ricky. I think this is important to have a comparative lesson as well. So, Irina, back to you, because this also deals with country system as it pertains to land acquisition.
Thank you. And thank you, Pak Mother. That's a very good statement, very helpful. I actually wanted to acknowledge that it's a major improvement, because compensation for adverse possession for 10 years, that's a very, very important enhancement of the country system. I think in our projects, which are in the portfolio, and specifically projects like RBLs, it will be quite important to capture all this updated information, because the laws and regulations change quite frequently, and we will need to catch up in all the assessments that ADB does in Indonesia. So I'm sure that this gap filling measure will definitely be reflected in all the new projects, or the projects that are planned in the pipeline for implementation. I also wanted to mention that, yes, land compensation is a very critical issue, but also in Indonesia, another critical issue that we saw, whereby it cannot be established that the land right exists and the land compensation applies. It's also quite critical, and Ricky touched upon this, to make sure that people get proper compensations on assets which are not land. And this is done at replacement cost. So I would imagine that it's still a very nuanced analysis when it comes to the compensation range and what people get entitled for. But we would still like to confirm our commitment to sort of this holistic assessment in terms of the types of land transactions that are being done, and also the types of impacts that are incurred by people. But overall, thanks a lot for highlighting this major enhancements. Over to you, Gelson.
Thanks, Irina. This is one last call for everybody who would like to come in. This has been a very good start of the discussion. There's no radio silence. I think some of you may just get fired up. I think the momentum, we have just said it. There's a lot really to unpack. But I think two things that really come in here. One is that the use and strengthening of the CSS is an effort that should continue under the new safeguards policy of the ADB. There's a lot to learn here and improve on there, especially when it relates to the project outcomes. Two, thank you so much for those of you who engage substantively. It's been a very insightful and productive discussion. I'm pretty sure there are more to discuss, and I hope that some of you can also join the other consultation on CSS this afternoon and also in the coming days. So on that note, I will now turn you over back to Azim for the quick poll that I hope you can join. Thanks, Azim.
Thanks so much, Gelson, for framing and contextualizing our way forward on the discussions and for moderating the Q&A session. And as you mentioned, it's clear that we've got an abundance of interest in this particular topic, and the invitation for stakeholders to join this afternoon session as well as subsequent sessions in the coming days. And thanks also to Bruce Dunn, Zara Abbas, Madhu Gupta, Irina Novikova, yourself, as well as Ricky Barbara and Patty Moore, as well as others who work tirelessly behind the scenes, facilitating the Q&A process and just making sure that the whole flow went smoothly. But of course, a huge special thanks to you, our participants, stakeholders, and informants for raising your insightful comments, the clarity of your questions, the sharing of experiences, and the constructive feedback. I want to reiterate once again that the comments on this particular consultation and thereafter will be considered in the final study report, which will inform the revision of ADB's standard and updating of the safeguards policy statement. But as Gelson said, please don't go. On your screen, we would like to gauge your feedback on how effective this particular consultation was. So if you can let us know your level of satisfaction with today's session, ranking the session from a 5 to a 1, 5 being the highest or most highly satisfied, to 1 being very dissatisfied, please give this session a rank between 1 and 5. 5 will be the highest score you can give, 1 will be the lowest score you can give, and we want to wrap that poll up in the next 40 to 50 seconds so that we can relay the survey results back to you. And then just a reminder that we have the Mentimeter poll, which is being flashed on the chat box now. And that poll will be open for another few hours. Please give us specific feedback in 3, 4, 5, even 6 sentences. Whatever you can offer will be very highly appreciated, and we'd be grateful to let us know how we can specifically improve the level of consultation and engagement with you, the stakeholders. So with that, next we have, again, turning back to Director Bruce Dunn to give us a summary of what we've heard and walk us through the next steps. But before we do, we can see that we've got 91% of you said that you are either somewhat satisfied or highly satisfied with the level of engagement, and 9% ranked this particular consultation neutral. We, of course, understand and appreciate that there is always room for improvement in these sessions. So please tell us and explain what specific improvements you would like to see on the menti.com poll, the link to which is in the chat box now. With that, I'd like to thank you all for your participation and turn it back over to Director Bruce Dunn to review the discussions and offer insights into the next steps, please.
Thank you very much, Azim. So greatly appreciating everyone's participation today. This is a very important topic, and it's actually one that I think we would like to revisit in more details at the country level. In fact, we are planning to have follow-up consultations with a number of our developing member countries, both directly through some country missions that we're planning, as well as through the ADB board. And your further perspectives on the strengthening as well as use of country safeguard systems, as well as other challenges that you may face in terms of the application of ADB safeguards. We're keen to hear all of that through that consultation process. So if you haven't had the opportunity today to be able to share thoughts, then please do. I see, in fact, actually through the chat now, one of our colleagues, Mr. Sethra from Cambodia, who's been very active in the consultations, has also joined and provided a further question. And I apologize, Mr. Sethra, that we've not had a chance today to address this one. We'll have a closer look at that and then come come back to you with details. I think your points also relate to some of the issues that we've covered today, so we'll look further at that. Of course, never enough time in these consultations to cover everything, so we will follow up after this session with anything that we've not addressed. Now, just in terms of a brief summary of some of the issues that we have discussed today, I wanted to highlight firstly that there is increasing convergence between national systems for country safeguards with the ADB and with other multilateral financial institutions or international good practices. In fact, the country diagnostic work that we have done, not just in Indonesia, India and Sri Lanka, but actually we've done more rapid assessments in more than 20 countries. They do show this increasing convergence. And I think to the point also of Mr. Mana from Indonesia, we increasingly see not necessarily these complete gaps in policy, but some areas that are a little bit more nuanced, where there is closer convergence, but perhaps some more operational differences, like the one that we've just been hearing about with the non-titled land residents that was just raised there for Indonesia. So I think that's something that's very important to recognize at the outset, that there is this increasing convergence. Secondly, of course, though, we have to acknowledge that governments, you have your own policy and legal frameworks that you've developed in the context of your own country by your own parliaments or governments. And so that obviously is the framework that we need to build off. In fact, ADB's policy itself says that we need to be consistent and ensure that national legal requirements are met. So we then have this issue about how do we apply ADB's own policy, imposed, if you like, in that context of where you have your own national standards. So the complexity and differences and divergences is something that we need to consider. Of course, we as an ADB multilateral development bank, we'd like to ensure that we apply the best possible policy practices and requirements down for the projects that we finance. As a development institution, we want to be able to support good practices and model good outcomes that is across the board, but we can't necessarily apply that one size fits all. We need to have more differentiated approaches, and we need to apply those based on risk. Of course, if we're dealing in low risk situations, then to be able to apply very high stringent requirements, and a lot of detailed documentation may not always be necessary. So I think this is something that we have to try and work through. We heard from you today that we need to be clear on what is required. You need templates and guidance on that, and that's something that we're planning to develop further. We also talked a bit about the processes of assessing legal equivalence, and I think we have approached it in a very legalistic way at ADB. We have to translate local laws. We get local lawyers involved, as well as safeguards experts, to try and understand the very details. And of course, it's necessary to understand those details. But what we were hearing from some today, at least, was that there should be a greater focus on outcomes. What is actually going to be the outcome at the end of the day for a specific project context, for a specific project risk? And that I think takes us away from just looking at the differences in the law to then saying, well, how would this be applied in this particular project context? So I think that points us in a little bit of the direction that we're thinking of heading towards with the update process, looking a little bit more towards material consistency, outcomes, and then the capacity and the track record. That's something that we need to understand. How are you implementing your existing legal frameworks, and what are the issues there? Just coming a little bit also to some of the future policy options. Zara did present on this also. We have a number of areas that we're thinking about. One is, how can we use our country partnership strategy and engagement processes at the country level more consistently, and use assessments of country systems at that stage to be able to then think at a portfolio level, what does this mean for the portfolio of projects? What could we be doing then at the country level or subnational levels or projects to then strengthen capacity? And are there other modalities that we've got, like policy-based lending, to be able to support your policy reform processes, or results-based lending, which is a way that allows us to maybe test and build capacity for the use of country systems, but at a more contained program level, rather than necessarily going across the board and saying we're going to apply country systems for any and all projects. So these are some of the things that we're thinking about. We'll be seeking to try and make some of these options clearer in the draft policy, and then of course we'll have further consultations, and we'll be keen to hear from you more with some of your views in the next stage. So with that, I'll just again like to thank you for joining today. Really appreciate your views, and again, if there's things that we've not covered today, please do join us for other consultations, or feel free to send us any written remarks, and we'll be very keen to get back to you in due course. So thank you again, and until next time, stay safe. Thank you.